Good evening, and welcome to Office Hours. My name is the Professor. This is going to be a short lecture series, and I'd like to talk about a lot of different academic pursuits that interest me. You know, I'm not qualified in really anything but language, but I do a lot of studying in my free time, and I always like to talk to people about this sort of thing. So hopefully this series will maybe introduce some people to some new ideas, or maybe give people a really good basic background in a lot of different academic pursuits. And for my part, I would like to become a better teacher. So, welcome, and it's good to have you aboard. Let's get started. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is language. I think that's the subject that's very close to a lot of people's hearts. Most of us speak some language or another. And most of us have some kind of an idea that some languages are kind of related and similar to other languages. And I think a lot of us have asked the questions, well, how did my language get to be the way it is today? Where did my language come from? Well, let's try to answer that question. Now, like I said, most people know that there are these things called language families. For example, English is in the same language family as Russian and Spanish and German and French. And 5,000 years ago, a long time ago, these were all the same language, and as people migrated, it split into different groups, and gradually we ended up with English. Now, English belongs to a subfamily, if you will, of this big language family. The subfamily is called Germanic. Germanic. And that means, as you might expect, that it's in the same group as German and Dutch and the Nordic languages. But I think a lot of people are surprised, at least I was, when I first found out that English did not, in fact, come from Latin. You know, we have so many Latin words in English. So obviously, English must have come from Latin. Well, it didn't, and here's what happened. Here's what happened. We're going to talk about it today. English, long ago, sounded just like German. So I want you to step into the time machine here with me. Let's get in the Wayback Machine and go back 1,000 years, if you will. Go back to about the year 1000 CE. Let's write that down. 1000 CE. Okay. And or if you'd like, you could call it AD. I say CE, but it doesn't really matter. English and German would have been pretty similar. In fact, we can go back and read ancient English manuscripts. If you've ever read the story Beowulf, it's a beautiful story. I highly recommend you read a translation of it into modern English. But if you've read the original, it doesn't sound like English at all. At all. It says things like it's totally different. Totally different. I mean, that doesn't sound like English to me. It sounds like German. Sounds maybe like Icelandic, but it doesn't sound like English. So, how was that so different? Why did it change into what it is now? French. French, as you might know, came from Latin a long time ago, but French speakers invaded England in the year 1066. So there was the Norman invasion. And with the Normans came a ton of French words. And if you'll remember, French originally was what language? Latin. Which means that a lot of the words that filtered into English after this invasion didn't have a Germanic root, but had a Latin root. And that's where people start to think, well, English, man, that's a very similar language to Latin, isn't it? And it is, and they're in the same family. But they're not as close as you might think. And we have the French, the Norman French, to thank for that. So, let's talk a little bit about these words that filtered through. We call them loan words. One word goes from one language to another, right? And so let's write that down. Loan words. Loan, like you loan money. These are loan words. There we go. And when the French showed up, they started using their words in English. And gradually, everybody else started using them too. Now, England was a very high traffic sort of place. They had people from all over Europe there, like the Angles and Saxons, and the French came in, and the Vikings, and all sorts of different people, Celts, Scots, right? But what about places in Europe that were a little bit more isolated? Do you think that their languages would probably change at the same rate, the drastic rate that English has changed in the last millennium? Of course not. Of course not. Let's look at one of the most isolated of all Germanic languages. In fact, the most isolated. Icelandic. Icelandic. Icelandic is a beautiful language. I'm studying it right now. It's wonderful. But Icelandic uses words that are 1,000 years old. You can read ancient Viking manuscripts and ancient sagas that were written 1,000 years ago. And you know what? Icelanders can read them like they were written yesterday. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that a trip? 1,000-year-old piece of parchment. You can read it just as if it were modern. Isn't that wonderful? Sometimes I wish I spoke Icelandic better so I would have this beautiful ancient language as part of my personal repertoire. But so this is what you should learn. But in any case, these very isolated languages change at a much slower pace than languages in high traffic areas with a lot of migration. Say, for example, England. That's why English, when we read Beowulf from 1,000 years ago, it reads just like a foreign language. When we read Icelandic, when an Icelandic speaker reads Icelandic from 1,000 years ago, he has no problem. Huh. I always like to think about that. This is the coolest thing, I think. I think that's the coolest thing. But anyway, at any rate, let's talk a little bit more about how we know English is a Germanic language. Like we said, English has a lot of loan words. Remember that word loan words from Latin, right? And that came from the French. But what about basic Germanic true English vocabulary? Well, let's take a very, very simple English sentence. Nothing complicated, right? Just words we use every day. Basic words. Let's think of a really simple sentence that even someone who's just starting to learn English would understand. Let's write. Here we go. Let's write the man has a house. That's a very simple sentence. Now let's translate it into German. If you speak German, you've already probably done this in your mind, but I don't speak German, so I hope you can humor me. It translates, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but it translates in German to der Mann. It's a very strange system of capital letters in German. I don't understand it at all. Hat ein Haus. Doesn't that sound similar? Der Mann hat ein Haus. The man has a house. You can even see where the words correspond to one another. And in these very, very basic words, and in this very, very basic grammar, we can see that English and German had to have come from the same language long, long ago. Long, long ago. Otherwise, we would have a different system of grammar. Otherwise, we would be using totally different words. It's almost like the same language here. And in fact, they are, as we will see in our next video. For maybe if you would like some homework, not that I have any authority to assign homework, but if you would like to do some of your own research, I recommend that you maybe look up some ancient English, Old English we call it, not Shakespeare. It has nothing to do with Shakespeare. Shakespeare's modern English. Let's look at some true Old English, like Beowulf, Finnsburg fragments. Those are both very good, and we'll be able to look at this ancient language, and we'll see how some of the words and the language itself it reads almost as if it were German. So maybe you could look look up something like that if this interests you. And we're going to, in our next lesson, we're going to apply what we've learned about language change and loan words and language families and all of this into some other European languages, some other languages near English. We're going to talk about Latin. We're going to talk about Spanish and Romanian and all these other really cool languages of Europe. So we can do that. Now, we're going to also, in our next class, or lecture, or whatever you want to call this, go even further back. We're going to go back in the mists of time to when 5,000 years ago all of these were the same language. And what we're going to find is going to frickin' rock your world. See you next time.